But the second factor, and this is a little bit hard for me because most of you are still students and most of you may not have it, but just imagine your parents now, okay? So your parents, the same story, your parents will consume according to what is their current income as well as their future income. But there's another factor that may also determine or affect your parents' consumption, and that is the wealth. What is the bahasa for wealth? Kekayaan, maybe, right? Wealth, okay? Let me give you an example. The house, okay? I'm assuming your parents have owned the house, okay? So that house itself has a value, right? That is kekayaan. That's part of the wealth, okay? Or another example is, suppose your parents have stock or bonds or any financial asset, okay? That is also part of the wealth, okay? So the amount of the consumption is not only determined by the current income and the future income, but also determined by the wealth. How much the value of the house that you own, and how much the financial asset that you have, or even simple money that you put in the bank. That is your financial wealth, okay? Which is not your income. The income is the interest rate that you receive from the bank, right? But whatever money that you have in the bank, that is your financial asset. That is part of your wealth, okay? So in macroeconomics, when we talk about the behavior of the consumption, it depends on the income and the wealth. And in the case of the income, there are two types, current income and the future income. Now, if you look at carefully, what determines the future income and what determines the wealth? Well, let's start with the future income. I mentioned earlier, the future income, when you calculate the present value, that depends on the interest rate currently as well as the future interest rate or expected interest rate, right? What about the wealth? Again, let's assume you have stock. Do you remember how do you determine the price of stock? There is a formula there, right? And in the formula, there is also interest rate in the denominator. Do you remember that? Basically, in the case of stock, the price depends on the dividend in the numerator and 1 plus the interest rate, which is in the denominator. So that means the R is also affecting the value of your financial wealth. In the case of bonds, the numerator is not dividend. The numerator is a fixed value. That is the face value of your bond. If you're holding, let's say, 1 million rupiah bond, that means the numerator is 1 million. But then what is the denominator? The denominator is 1 plus yield for year one, and for year two, yield in year two, and so on and so on, right? So either you're talking about the expected income or you're talking about the financial wealth, there's always variables that contain expectation. Expected exchange rate, expected interest rate, expected yield, expected return of the stock, and so forth. All are expected. And again, let me repeat, when we talk about expected, we can only estimate because there's some components that, economists cannot really be precise about expected. It's all depends on information about your psyche, your psychology, and so forth, right? But the point here is that depends on expectation. So all in all, to summarize, that important variable, which is called consumption, again, I don't need to repeat why consumption is important because it constitutes more than half of the GDP. So that important variable, which is called consumption, it's so much depending on expectation. That is the main message of today's class, basically. So it's not only depending on income, but also on expectation. And the channel of the expectation entering the consumption is either through the discount factor, which is the expected interest rate, or through the price of the financial asset. Also the price of the housing, you know. In the case of developing countries like Indonesia, maybe not everybody have the house. So, maybe the discussion is better focus on the financial asset, okay, because there are more cases people have financial asset but not having a house. But the story basically similar. The price in those wealth, either it's housing or financial asset, depends on the expectation, okay, whether it's expected yield or expected return. Is that clear? So the whole message about consumption and expectation is that the consumption behavior depends on the standard macro variables like income, taxes, and so forth, but also depends on expectation. And that makes it imprecise. That makes it not easy for any forecaster, for any macroeconomist to really make a good forecast what happened with the consumption next year. Because usually the mistake is not on the standard variables, but the mistake is in the expectation. Because forecasting expectation is very difficult. Any question?